Hello, and welcome to Daytime, your places for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to listen to the story until the end, because at the end of the week, we will be doing a questionnaire about this week's stories, and that person that get it right will be receiving $100. So without further ado, I present to you. I was hired to notice things out of place.
As a kid, I was scared of pretty much everything. At night, I'd see faces moving in the wallpaper. I'd see branches slither like snakes, piles of clothes turn to slumped bodies, lamps looked like heads, and the front of cars grinned at me with sinister intent. I could also hear them. A creaking door would sound like a groan, the wind would scream, and floorboards would breathe heavy sighs. To me, there were ghouls, ghosts, and monsters around every corner. Needless to say, I was a nervous kid. Turns out it wasn't just an active imagination. I have a condition. It basically boils down to chronic overactive pareidolia. You know that thing where you can see faces in cars or shapes of people in trees? That's pareidolia. It is a sort of defense mechanism that humans have evolved to notice camouflaged creatures like jaguars and snakes and to discern the sounds of encroaching predators. But to me, it is about 16 times more noticeable than what is normal for the average person. I see things everywhere, all the time. Of course, there were treatments. By age 12, I had tried 6 different regimens over a total of 4 years, and the side effects were brutal. Some would make me irritable, while others would make me hyper-focused. One type of medication just straight up put me to sleep. By age 18, I thought I'd never get a job. I was barely dragging myself through school, and there was no way I'd make it through college. I was on a course of drugs that barely kept me together. But they gave me these awful tics. I'd drop things, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my leg would shoot out and trip me. I was a mess. My mom had to cover the stairs in handrail and grip tape. A few years ago, I had a standing meeting with the county employment services every Thursday. I hated it. On a particularly bad day, my mom had to drive me there. The meds were kicking my ass. She dropped me off at the end of the street, and just in that short walk to the office, I almost tripped into a brick wall. I was so flustered, I knocked over a trash can. But for the first time in a couple of years, I had an interview with a potential employer. I didn't think much of her. She was just some old woman in a warm coat. She introduced herself as Teresa, and told me that she'd heard a lot about me. She offered me a trial and a hefty one-time payment. I didn't get clear idea about what I was supposed to do, but she told me that secrecy was part of it. The only demand she had was that I stop taking my meds. Still feeling the trash smell on my pants, I took Teresa up on her offer. On my first day of work, I had no idea what to expect. I'd been off my meds for a week, and I had barely slept. It was hard to wrap my head around the world as I'd seen it as a kid. I'd see faces in the walls, in the shadows, in the leaves, in patterns, pretty much everywhere. I'd hear voices and screams in every braking car, and crinkling paper and creaking floors. It was hard staying focused, and I was so jumpy I could barely move without flinching. Teresa picked me up in a gray sedan. She was wearing a headset and kept looking over at the GPS. I noticed her leg was twitching, and that she kept biting her lip. She barely looked at me that whole ride. We finally arrived at a small yard about a 40-minute drive off the highway. There were 2 large trailers and a single-story, rundown prefab house from the 60s. One of those things with cheap wood panels and matching broken windows. There were 8 other vehicles in the yard. 4 sedans, 2 vans, a Jeep, and a bus. They'd set up warning tape, a command tent with laptops and an antenna, spotlights, and half a dozen crates covered with blue tarps. There were armed men with assault rifles, security personnel with handcuffs, and a couple of medics standing by with first aid kits and stretchers. I was swarmed as soon as I stepped out of the car. They fitted me with a headset, protective gloves, a heart monitor, and tagged me with a plastic ribbon around my left wrist. All the while, Teresa was just looking around, a bead of sweat stinging her eye.
What are we looking at?
She asked.
3, 4?
Just 1.
I heard in the headset.
We got it early. We got the spot.
On site.
She responded.
Any blues?
No blues, we're clear.
Teresa finally turned to me. She faced me, put her hands on my shoulders, and talked slowly.
This seems like a lot.
She said,
All I want you to do is to go inside carefully and tell me what you see.
"Why?" I asked. "What's in there?"
I don't know.
She sighed.
None of us knows. But we think you can see it.
"Is it dangerous?" She shook her head.
We don't know. We're trying to get to know them.
There was a flurry of instructions. I had to sign a waiver. They took pictures of me from 6 different angles and took several blood samples. They took a swab from my tongue, checked my eyes, and fitted me with a pair of safety goggles. Teresa took them from me just seconds later.
Nothing around the eyes.
She said,
You need to see clearly.
They asked me to approach the door while they were running some kind of diagnostic. Weapon checks, system checks, ready checks. It felt like we were launching a rocket. I could feel my legs shaking.
I'm with you all the way.
Teresa said over the headset.
You can leave at any time. Just tell me what you see, and I really mean what you see.
A countdown began. At 0, the spotlights turned on and the entire yard turned into a soundless ghost town. Everyone held their breaths, and it was my turn. I stepped inside. A simple 1-story house. 3 rooms, a bathroom, a kitchen. Someone had clearly lived there until recently. There were still clothes flung over a chair in the living room. The power was off, but the pale spotlights coming in through the windows made it feel like I was walking through a hospital waiting room. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I didn't know what to expect, but this payday could be the boost I needed to get my own place. A paycheck with 4 zeros for a single day of work. But standing there looking into the sterile living room, I was having doubts.
What do you see? Notice anything?
Just furniture, a couch, an old TV, a fancy carpet, nothing out of the ordinary. I just walked around saying out loud what I was seeing. As the minutes passed, Teresa was getting impatient.
These are just things.
She said.
I need you to tell me what you really see.
I entered the bathroom and immediately felt this awful feeling in the pit of my stomach. A noise tickled my ear. Looking in the bathroom mirror, I could see something moving behind me. In a heartbeat, I caught a glimpse of a pair of blue eyes. I turned around screaming. Something moved. I flung myself backwards, closing the bathroom door with the tip of my fingers. I stumbled, tearing down the shower curtains. Laying there with my feet in the air, I tried to remember to breathe. Rarely have I ever been so scared that I had to remind myself to breathe. My fingers tingled with adrenaline.
Tell me what you saw.
Teresa yelled.
What's in there?
Blue eyes. It had blue eyes.
Did you see where it went?
I didn't. To the best of my knowledge, it was still outside the door.
Look again.
She continued.
Look again, then get out.
She had to coax me out of the bathtub. She encouraged me, spurred me on, and reminded me that I had to leave that room one way or the other. It probably took them 15 minutes to get me out of the tub, and when they did, I could barely feel my feet. When I finally opened the bathroom door, I couldn't see anyone. The hallway was empty. I carefully stepped out, looking around. Nothing. Standing in the middle of the living room, I felt like an idiot. This was exactly what I was taking my medication for, paranoia and sudden bouts of fear. It dawned on me that maybe I was influenced by all the people outside and their preparations. I was walking in here expecting to see something. They'd worked me up, so of course I was seeing things. But then again, there was an odd painting on the wall that I hadn't paid attention to earlier. It was the strangest thing. It was a sort of thrift store painting, showing 2 women walking across a bridge on a hot summer's day. It was sort of generic, but I'd been hyper-vigilant when I first stepped in. You know that feeling when you say a word over and over so many times that it starts sounding like a noise. That's the feeling that fell over my eyes. The picture started to blur and disappear, turning into swirling colors. And there, in that blur, I saw those blue eyes. There were small blue spots in the water on the sides of the bridge in the painting. That's what I'd seen, and there I'd seen a face. Something blending into my sight, disappearing. And for a second, I knew for certain that I hadn't seen this painting when I first stepped inside. And now it knew that I could see it. I felt it. I slowly started to back out. "There's something in the painting," I whispered. "In the living room."
You sure?
Teresa asked.
Absolutely sure.
Absolutely.
Get out.
I rounded the corner and heard the floorboards creak. I could no longer see the painting, and I could sense something move. Backing out of the front door and into the cool autumn air, I could feel hands on my shoulder. Armed men pulled me back, and paramedics started to check my eyes with flashlights. They asked me all sorts of personal questions, like my name, my mother's maiden name, and the name of the president. I was told to lay down as I heard a team breach the house with stun guns, cattle prods, nets, and a crate. Laying there and feeling the pressure subside, I just cried and laughed. I didn't even notice Teresa sitting down next to me. I was given a cold drink and a pill, and I took it without question.
You did good.
She said.
You're done. You're done.
What was that? What's in there?
Something only a special mind can see.
That was my first time working with Teresa. Over the coming years, I would be called in about once or twice a month, and the pay I got from those few days were enough to get me out of my parents' house. Teresa would check in with me weekly, and I had to submit to regular checkups. But more often than not, I was completely off the leash. I started to learn a bit more about the company I was working for and what they were doing. I started getting payments from Hatchet Biotechnica, a subsidiary of Hatchet Pharmaceuticals. My official title was contractor, a title that was repeated like a name. Teresa started going into greater details on what to look for and how to act, but that first mission was a sort of test to prove myself. I had no idea what I was actually proving, but it felt like my tendency to discern patterns and seeing dangers helped me along. I learned a bit more about their procedures. For example, they were adamant about checking for blues. This meant surveying the nearby area to look for some kind of infection, usually taking the form of miscolored flowers, most often blue, but not always. Sometimes tulips, most often sunflowers. Once they just found a bunch of teeth sticking out of the wall. Whenever they checked for blues, this is what they would look for. Something overtly strange and unnatural. When something like this was found, the whole mission would be called off, and they would use controlled explosives to just take out the entire area. In more populated areas, they'd set up tents and use flamethrowers. I remember once the week before Christmas when 6 men with flamethrowers were called in to burn down a greenhouse. I'll never forget the way the flames reflected off their visors. To them, it all just looked like flames. But I saw something else. I saw bodies, wreathing in the flames. I heard screams in the shattered glass. And in the charred remains of melted plastic, I'd see pained faces glaring at me with hateful black eyes. Up until a few months ago, I had worked a total of 33 cases over 2.5 years. Every case, I'd step into a location and look for 1 to 3 things hiding in plain sight. Up until that point, I still had no idea what they actually were. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of something running past me, or see a pair of blue eyes looking at me from across the room. Every time I just reported it and left. A chair, a fridge, a suspicious window. Hell, once it was a music box. This time we were just coming up to a house. It was a rainy autumn evening and the area was already set up when we got there. I saw "For Sale" sign knocked over by one of the Jeeps who'd taken a wide turn. I got suited up, blood samples, plastic wrap, all that jazz. It was set up to be just another job. Although I was still nervous, I was getting better.
No blues?
Asked Teresa.
None,
Said one of the armed men.
we're looking at a single tango.
You sure?
Teresa squinted.
First report said 6.
Secondary reading says 1. We might have runners.
Notify the Galapagos.
She sighed.
Put him on the hunt.
She turned to me with a smile, tapping me on the shoulder.
In and out, you got this.
I got this, I repeated. Yeah. Standard routine, countdown, spotlights, game on. It felt like stepping onto a stage. As I walked through the door and saw my shadow stretch out across the floor, I felt like a hunter. That I was the one to fear, and that whatever stayed in this house tried to hide for good reason. The floor is crooked, I noted. Strange place.
You sure?
Yeah, I nodded. Definitely. I steadied myself and started checking the rooms one by one. I waited for that feeling to emerge. My eyes seeing through the obvious and seeing the picture beneath the picture, the blue eyes emerging from nothing, and the patterns of shadowy figures growing clearer. Just relaxing and expecting that feeling to wash over me was enough to put me at ease, but I could still feel a primal part of me tickling my nerves, expecting me to panic. But nothing happened. I checked the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom. There was nothing. Just a strangely crooked floor, empty rooms, and the echo of my own footsteps. An empty guest bedroom with a single window. Through it, I imagined scowling faces in the trees outside. 20 minutes passed and I got nothing. I reported to Teresa, and she assured me we were still getting readings from inside the house. Something was still in there with me, but I hadn't seen anything. I went through cycles of denial, fear, and anger over and over. What was I missing? Finally, I just sat down in the middle of the living room floor. I scratched my eyes, sighed, and tried to relax. Teresa, I'm not feeling it. Are you sure? There was no response. Teresa?
Yeah.
She responded absent-mindedly.
Yeah, we're good. Hold on for a minute.
We're good? I asked. What do you mean we're good? Again, no response. I stomped around for another 10 minutes before I went up to a window facing the front yard. It was hard to see through the glare of the spotlight. Teresa, I'm coming out. The place is empty. As soon as I opened the front door, I saw 24 faces fixed on me. Maybe they were surprised to see me, but I got the sense that there was something else. I could tell something was off. They all looked at me with strange expressions. Some neutral, some smiling ear to ear. One of the paramedics just stared at me with slack-jawed terror. It was as if they didn't know what to feel or how to express it. A hole sunk through my stomach. I got that hollow feeling as my eyes glazed over, like I was staring at something false, something hiding a pattern. This was the sense I'd been looking for inside, and now I was feeling it. In the far back, I saw Teresa. She stepped out from behind a jeep, smiling ear to ear. Behind the shape of her face, her eyes emerged, glowing with a cold blue. One by one, their eyes flared up in a blue glow, and there in a moment, my paranoid sight registered human-like shapes in the grass around them. Headless, mauled bodies and imposters, lookalikes, mimics, nightmare beings having tricked us into a trap. One by one, smiles started creeping across their faces. Rows of impossibly sharp teeth hiding long tongues, their fingers growing longer, their necks elongating. They were losing their disguises and facing me, head-on, unafraid. Nothing was said out loud, not a word. But to me, it was as if the wind itself was screaming for me to run. I slammed the door behind me and ran. Faces were coming out of the walls, door handles turning into hands, grasping at my clothes, my distorted face reflecting in windows and mirrors with jawless grins. I couldn't blink. Every heartbeat, a new horror forced my eyes open. There were more doors than I remembered. There were more windows than there should be. The kitchen suddenly had a skylight, and there were 4 fridges. Countless paintings had appeared in the master bedroom, depicting cruel and blood-drenched horrors. They were already here trying to surround me, and my mind was racing to remember what was real and what wasn't. Rushing to the back of the guest bedroom, I remembered there being only one window. Now there were 2. I had to roll the dice, take a guess, do something. As I grabbed the window frame, I imagined teeth slamming into my hands, tongues licking across my palms, wide smiles sating their hunger. But this time it was just my imagination. I burst through the window and took off running into the woods. Through the night, I just kept going. My chest hurt from holding the screams in. Without my medication, everything in the dark looked like something reaching for me, trying to eat me, trying to grab me. Creaking branches sounded like laughter, and howling winds were screams. I must have run for hours when my foot got caught between 2 rocks. As I tumbled to the ground, twisting my ankle, I saw them descend on me. I felt their fingers scratching me. I writhed on the ground, screaming for them to just let me go, to just please let me go. But after a few seconds, I realized I had just scratched myself on the underbrush. There was no one there. I was safe. I broke down crying, trying to ignore the twisted face reflecting off the full moon above. Eventually, I made my way home. There were no messages waiting for me. All my work numbers had been taken offline. All ways to contact them were just gone, and there was no info on the firm that hired me. Hatchet Biotechnica exists only on paper. There's no location, no contact info, and no names attached. It's all a front. I haven't heard from Teresa since. I think that whoever I've been working for have just assumed I'm dead. That's why I decided to share this anonymously. Those who know who I am can reach out to me. And for those who don't, I just have a word of warning. Be observant. Trust your intuition. It might save your life.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories, straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a celebration turns into a nightmare when things become all too real. So on the night of this full moon, prepare for your doom, because something went wrong with our escape room.
We wanted to do something special for Lindsay's birthday. She'd turned 30 just as the COVID lockdown came into effect, so we missed a big one. So when the stars finally aligned and our calendars synced up, we decided we were going to get her something special. A girls' night out for the first time in years. Lindsay always had a bit of a dark streak. Her birthday is just 1 week before Halloween, so by then everything is pumpkin flavored and covered in plastic spider webs. Spooky things were just part of her aesthetic, and even as a mother of two, we'd still see her sporting a skull necklace or pentagram earrings every now and then. But we were running out of time. We couldn't decide what to do. Some of us could set aside the whole weekend, others had to work or be home by midnight. It was getting difficult to settle on a single thing that would fit everyone. That is, until Aggie found something that was just perfect. An escape room. We all met up on a Saturday. It was me, Dawn, Aggie, and Lindsay. After a fancy dinner and a long walk, we arrived at the Apostle Collective building. They'd opened about a year ago, and they'd been booked solid all spring long. That we managed to book a room this close to Halloween was nothing short of a miracle. Some of you have probably heard about them. They're sort of a chain. They got like 5 locations, most of them in Minnesota. The place was spot on. It didn't just have the classic Halloween stuff, but smoke machines, hidden speakers, projectors, the whole kit. The staff were dressed up in prosthetics, looking like old-time zombie carnival workers. We stepped in. They checked our booking and gave us a little box of free popcorn. Lindsay was ecstatic. We'd told the staff it was all for her birthday, so they paid a little extra attention to her. She deserved it. As we stepped up to the door, they gave us an introduction.
You're stepping into the box of the godless grinning witch,
We were told.
This is our longest, scariest room yet. Pretty much brand new apart from playtesters. You were lucky to get a booking. The other group canceled last minute. Either way, all you need to solve it can be found in there. Just try not to break any furniture or move something that's been bolted down. None of the clues will require a lot of force, so you wouldn't have to break anything or exert yourself.
Are there actors?
Dawn asked.
You can tell us, right?
I can, but I won't. But whatever happens, you won't be harmed. Something might reach for you, chase you, touch you, but no harm. So please try to keep that in mind.
Are you leaving the door open?
Aggie asked.
Can we leave at any time?
Just knock or send us a text. The door locks automatically, but we can open it remotely with the click of a button. Just knock.
So what's the story? What's our deal?
Interrupted Lindsay.
Ghouls? Ghosts? Vampires?
I was so happy to see Lindsay like that. She could barely stand still. The box of the godless grinning witch is about a cruel witch who have trapped 4 souls in a little box. As they scramble to get out, they start realizing they're not alone. The souls have to find a way out while avoiding the monstrous beings trapped in there with them. There were no more hints, and part of the experience was going into it knowing just 2 things. We had been captured, and we weren't alone. Aggie kept her phone so she could text for hints and reach the staff if necessary. The rest of us put ours away. This was going to be an intense game, with a solve time average of about 4 hours. That said, we were allowed to stay until midnight. And if we solved it without a hint, we got a very special prize. We could also send them a text to pause the game for a bathroom break. We put away our coats, Dawn did a little stretch, and Lindsay was visibly shaking with excitement. This was gonna be good. I was the last one to step inside. Just as the door closed behind us, I noticed the staff members suddenly look off to the side. Their brow furrowed as they stepped back. In the blink of an eye, they were gone. Then the door slammed shut. There was something off, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. They were so excited, and the game was just getting started. It was a black, windowless room. Lindsay was being chatty, but Dawn and Aggie were kind of wondering what the hell they'd agreed to. After a few seconds, there was this chilling laugh, followed by a light. They'd installed a video projector in the ceiling. The entire room lit up as we looked up to see a video of an impossibly large woman looking down on us, like we were the size of a Rubik's Cube in her hand. She had these sunken, joyless eyes and a wide grin that stretched ear to ear. Clearly CGI. Far above her, we could see the full moon. As an effect, it was pretty impressive.
I think she's based on a local legend, said Aggie. Some kind of pilgrim myth. I've heard about this.
As the grinning witch put her hand over us, the room went dark once again, and electric torches flared up along the walls. The game was on. There were all kinds of items all around. Paintings, carpets, chests, tables with strange runes. Classic escape room stuff. We all split up and started looking through whatever we could first get our hands on. Aggie found some sort of pamphlet and started calling out names. Dawn found a set of numbers under a chair. Lindsay was just soaking up the atmosphere, trying to find clues in the paintings. About 30 minutes in, there was this awful sound. A rattling page, followed by snapping metal. There was a loud moan and approaching footsteps. There were a few spots in the room that were obvious hiding places, so we hurried inside. Lindsay couldn't stop giggling, and even I felt my pulse racing a bit. But nothing happened. The pre-recorded noises came and went. There was this disconnect, like a pair of real footsteps were supposed to sort of take over the sound, but nothing happened. We just hid for a couple of minutes, then stepped out.
Did we miss something?
Dawn asked. There was a pregnant pause as we looked around the room. Nothing. Strange. We made decent progress. We found a set of keys that opened a chest, which revealed a black light disguised as a candle. Using it, we found a set of codes to decipher using a set of runes. We found out there was a touchpad behind a painting, which we could use to write a code. That in turn opened a small side room full of clues. So, yeah, decent progress. Then again, we heard strange noises, rattling chains, loud moans, and thundering footsteps. We figured this was it, that the previous one had just been a warning. So again, we rushed to our hiding spaces. And again, nothing happened. This time, something was clearly broken. There was a recorded voice coming from the ceiling.
I think he likes you.
It whispered.
Like hell he does.
Aggie frowned.
He's not coming out.
Relatable.
Grinned Dawn.
I'm using the bathroom. Text him.
Aggie texted the staff as Dawn pulled on the door. It was still locked.
Wait,
Aggie said.
they haven't responded yet?
Dawn knocked on the door. There was no response. No sound.
Still nothing,
Added Aggie.
No one.
Something turned in my stomach. That sudden pinch of worry that something had gone terribly wrong. As Dawn kept pulling on the door, Lindsay stopped smiling. The pep in her step faded.
Is this part of it?
Lindsay asked.
Is it a meta thing? Are you in on it?
No, I protested. It's just one of those auto-locking doors and they forgot to set it open. Right? It's probably nothing, right?
No response.
Sighed Aggie, holding her phone up.
I'm calling Hank.
As the others gathered around Aggie, I stepped away for a second. Aggie's husband, Hank, wasn't picking up. I put my ear up against the walls and listened. figuring I might be able to hear the staff chit-chatting in the next room over. There were supposed to be actors here, or staff just outside. Something about this wasn't adding up. As I leaned against the wall listening, I heard footsteps again. But this time, they didn't sound pre-recorded. I hurried to the others, holding a finger up to my lips. "Listen," I mouthed. There was a slit in the wall where a door could open from the other side. Someone was coming this way.
Is that them?
Dawn asked.
Is that?
Those were big steps. Really big, heavy steps. Without knowing who was coming, we all just silently agreed that this whole thing felt completely off. No one knew what to do.
Hide!
Dawn hissed. There were plenty of things to hide behind, but the room was small. They'd find us in no time. Despite that, Lindsay and I hid in the small side room. We shut the door, held our breaths, and waited. Dawn was small enough to fit in a chest, while Aggie hid behind a curtain in the back of the room. In the low light, it might just work. As the door slid open, I could hear heavy breathing, big, dragging feet, and a weird, wet, snorting noise. A clear scratching sound as something sharp was pulled across the floor.
Please pick the small one first, Byron.
A hoarse voice wheezed.
Go on, pick it.
A pig-like screech echoed through the room in response. This wasn't a recording. This was coming from whoever was in the room. There really was something there. Something big. I heard the sudden sound of tearing fabric and a scream. This awful, drawn-out death scream. A shrieking, pleading terror as someone was physically dragged out of the room. I'd never heard anything like it, and it was impossible to tell who it was. Then, with a thud, it all went silent. The door was closed. Lindsay and I peeked out. The curtain that Aggie had hid behind had been torn down. She was gone. There was blood. We found Dawn curled up in a chest, shivering. She couldn't make eye contact. When we tried to snap her out of it, she just screamed and clawed at us. Her eyes were wild, and she was barely breathing.
Did you see anything?
Lindsay whispered.
Wait, what? What was it?
Dawn just shook her head. I could see there was a crack in the wooden chest. She might have been able to see something. We just weren't getting through to her.
I'm not waiting for that to come back.
Lindsay said.
Help me get the lights.
What? I shivered. The light. It can't find us in the dark. We went torch by torch and shut it all down. The room went completely dark, and we gathered by Dawn's hiding spot. We crouched next to her, trying to calm down.
It's part of it, right?
Whispered Dawn.
Is Aggie in on it? Are you just fucking with me?
No, something's wrong. I whispered back. I'm sorry, Dawn. There's...
Bullshit.
Wheezed Lindsay.
This is fucking bullshit, and I'm not... Who's got the phone?
We all went quiet. Aggie was the one with the phone.
There has to be fucking... something,
said Lindsay.
Feel around.
For what? I wheezed. Where? I don't know. How the fuck should I know? Just try. Do something. I stepped up to the door. Still locked and no one outside. I started feeling around, only to find 2 cables. They might just be a light or something, but there was another possibility. Look, maybe the door is locked until we text them or time is up. What if the door unlocks? What if it unlocks when we solve it?
It won't work,
sighed Lindsay.
There are some things in here that require a staff member to manually click something open with a button. Some clues just won't work without it. But I don't think there's anyone out there anymore.
What about fire escapes? You can't just lock people in a room? I could hear Lindsay sink down to the floor.
This is a mistake,
she cried.
All of it.
The side door slammed open again. Big, heaving footsteps came in. Even in the complete dark, we could tell there was someone huge in here with us. Someone who smelled like dirt. Again, something sharp scraped across the floor.
Byron, get another one.
A voice laughed.
Whichever you like.
I just pushed myself up against the wall and turned my head on the side. I tried making myself as flat as possible. I knew Lindsay was doing the same. Dawn, on the other hand, was panicking.
No!
She coughed. No! A loud, pig-like snort. The scraping thing was lifted off the ground. I heard 2 feet firmly planting in the ground as something heavy was lifted, and Dawn fell to the ground with a thud. She tried to talk, but she'd had all wind knocked out of her. Instead, she just tried to get away. I heard a loud exhale, the kind of sound where someone gets something heavy dropped on them. And in the seconds that followed, I heard this large being, Byron, violently drag Dawn out of the room. To the untrained ear, her scream was almost the same as Aggie's. As the door slammed shut again, I could hear Lindsay sobbing just a few feet away. I couldn't move. My body was stopping me from comforting her, and I'd been so tense my neck was stiff from pushing my face against the wall. For what felt like hours, we just waited. It was probably just minutes. Finally, Lindsay got up. She fumbled her way over to one of the tables, flipped it on its side, and broke a leg off. Then she did it again and handed the second leg to me.
Don't just let them, you know?
She said.
Okay?
Yeah. I nodded. Yeah. No, I won't. I started to hyperventilate as my fingers wrapped around the slippery wood. There was no way I could use this. My hands were so sweaty the thing was falling out of my grip. I couldn't fight. Not with that. Not against whatever was taking us out one by one.
Maybe barricade the door?
She said.
Yeah, let's...
Wait! It was a good idea, but it was too dark. That, and I could hear the footsteps coming again. Faster this time. Determined. The thing entered on its own. No guiding voice. Lindsay and I held hands and pushed ourselves up against the wall. I couldn't hear it dragging anything this time, but I could hear lips smacking, followed by these high-pitched micro-grunts. Whatever it was loud, and it was munching on something. It wandered around for a while, feeling around the table, the chest, and even the little side room. After a few minutes, it seemed satisfied not to have found us and headed back to the door. Just as it was about to exit, we hit the 90-minute mark. The game, partly automated, was still running. The projector came on again, displaying this large woman in the ceiling. The entire room was lit up. It immediately saw us. The thing was easily 6'8". It was dressed in this sort of torn varsity jacket, with filthy, mud-covered jeans. There were long strands of black fur poking out of every cut and tear in its clothes, making it look like a badly stuffed scarecrow. It wasn't fully human. His head looked like a boar. It looked right at us, its snout twitching with excitement. He had these small, dark eyes. I'll never forget how, when it looked at me, they lit up with nothing but joy. No matter the species, you can just tell. It was looking forward to this. There was no fear, no malice, just unbridled, violent joy. Like a kid tearing into a happy meal. Meeting my eyes, the thing just screamed like a wounded pig and charged. I stepped on my own feet and stumbled backwards. Hadn't it been for Lindsay still holding my hand, I would have gone down like a sack of flour. Instead, I barely stayed on my feet as we rushed to the other side of the room.
Still down there, playthings?
The recording in the ceiling spoke.
Will you not give up?
As the video played above us, the light in the room shifted. Whenever she was more in frame, the light grew more distant. When she moved back, the full moon came into view.
He'll get you, playthings.
The narration continued.
It is so futile.
There was blood on his jacket. Fresh blood. As the video finished, we'd ran a full lap of the room. We were back at the door, and this time he was charging straight ahead. At the last second, Lindsay let go of my hand and we fell to the side. The boar man ran straight into the door. It seemed to upset him as he focused all his rage on it. Pounding, tearing, biting. All the while roaring like a wounded animal. His joy was gone. This was frustration. Hunger. It didn't take him long to break the door open, and as light flooded in, he turned to look down the hall. The brightness from the street outside seemed to scare him as he took off out the back. Lindsay and I stayed on the floor a couple of seconds, just to ensure ourselves that the thing was gone. We eventually crawled out the door, ready to run. There were bloodied handprints on the walls, something resembling a fingernail, blood spatter on the ceiling. We ignored it all, got up, and went straight for the exit. Come on, come on, come on. I'd sprained my ankle, and Lindsay was bleeding from her hand. We were about 40 feet from the door when we heard that voice again. The voice that had guided the boar man. Neither of us turned to see him. We just had to keep going.
Tell them.
He screamed.
Tell them there will be no carnival games in the name of her ladyship. Tell them to fear. Tell them all. Tell them to fear the grinning witch.
He laughed so hard he couldn't breathe. Lindsay pulled me along when all I wanted was to collapse and cry. We burst through the doors and into the night. And far behind us, the laughter faded. Putting it all in writing feels a bit weird, like I'm telling someone else's story. But Lindsay is as real as the last time I met her, and I don't think we'll ever overcome the trauma. I still feel myself stopping at random times, listening for footsteps. Lindsay has developed a sort of claustrophobia. No more locked doors. Ever. The police chalked it all up as an armed robbery. The security cameras picked up 4 intruders getting in through the back door. 3 hooded figures and a large masked man in a varsity jacket. The case was handed off to a special unit and promptly dropped. We didn't get any updates after that. It wasn't filed as a kidnapping or murder or similar. All they could prove was the break-in. But as far as what happened to Dawn, Aggie, and the staff members, no one knows. There was no car speeding off into the night. There were no witnesses. They seemingly vanished into thin air. It is true that the Grinning Witch was a bit of a local legend. A witch that collected cursed animals and people and put them all in a box. The escape room barely had anything to do with it, though. It was just loosely based on that idea. But somehow that was enough to draw out some kind of hate sect. But I'll never forget the man with the boar head. No matter how I think about it, no matter how I try to wrap my head around it, I can't stop thinking about him. That was no man in a mask. That snout was wet, and those teeth were real. Nut jobs are everywhere, but that thing? No, it couldn't be. It literally couldn't be. I don't think this will ever be resolved. Why would it be? Things like this don't just happen. They don't. But this time they did.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man discovers a long-lost language. So, on this ordinary Christmas, things have become the strangest. Because I stumbled upon a dead language.
As part of my doctorate, I was hired as a lab assistant working with pediatric treatment. We were working on a paper measuring the exposure effect of a potential contaminant. While my colleagues were working on the measured effects on adults and the elderly, my team would work with children. The potential disruption to developing adolescence was deemed important enough to have a separate set of experiments and measurements. The study garnered unilateral attention and funding of not only 1, but 4 different pharmaceutical companies, Hatchet PH being the main contributor. I was hired pretty late in the process. I wasn't even sure what the contaminant was, as it was just designated as the contaminant. Apparently it was something that resided just under the topsoil in a large residential area. To not taint our measurements, me and my colleagues were given minimum information about the symptoms to look for and what to expect. Instead, we were provided a set of experiments and willing participants. It was all fast and haphazard. Most of us started on a Monday, and Tuesday the following week was the day of our first experiment. Little time to prepare, get settled, or even understand. Still, this could be big. big enough to launch a career. The experiment, described as the Cognition and Ocular Development Assessment, CODA, was to be performed with full consent and supervision of the parental guardians. All children were between 6 to 10 years old, and none of them had any observed deformities or illnesses. We were given limited access to certain medical records to make sure our study didn't have the potential to cause any harm. Then again, I'd read the experiment checklist, and there was nothing that could damage anyone. If anything, I argued the results would be pretty much useless. As Tuesday came around, me and my 2 colleagues had prepared as best we could. The 3 of us would put 1 participant each through a series of tests. The CODA was 3 tests over a total of 3 hours. The parents were to be asked for consent before and after each step, and given the ability to stop any test at any given time. The experiment overall was surprisingly simple. It was supposed to be a measurement of cognitive and emotional development, mostly tested through facial and spatial recognition. The day of the experiment, I first met Logan, an 8-year-old kid sporting a baseball cap and a brand new Pokemon t-shirt. His mom was a bit anxious, but from what I'd been told, she'd been generously compensated. As I met them in the parking lot and lead them inside, I promised her we'd go through the specifics. "Don't worry," I said. "We're mostly going to look at pictures. Doesn't sound too bad, huh?" He shook his head, but I'd yet to see him smile. Maybe his mom's anxiety rubbed off on him. The testing room was somewhat small and made entirely out of concrete. There was a pair of opposite two-way mirrors on each side of the room. The walls were painted this sickly mint green, a color so neutral it hurt to look at. The first test was all about emotional intelligence. In sets of 6 pictures each, I was to show Logan various expressions and ask him which mostly correlated to an emotion. If they answered objectively wrong, according to a chart, we were supposed to ask them to explain their choice. Simple enough, I'd done something similar before. But this is where I first realized that Logan wasn't some ordinary kid. As I laid out the first image set, I asked him to identify the happiest face. Clearly, it was card number 3, and Logan answered as such without hesitation. In the second image set, he was asked which one was the saddest. Again, it was number 3. He answered correctly again. In the third picture, the 6 pictures were a wild mix. Some sad, some happy. One guy was sleeping in the corner. "Which one is the angriest?" I asked. There was a correct answer. Number 4. A woman furrowing her brow and exposing her teeth. Yet Logan looked at them all for a long time.
"Number 6,
he said finally, pointing at the sleeping man. "How come?" I asked, following protocol.
"It's complicated. They almost killed his mom."
Kid seemed almost distant, staring at the picture. What the hell? He answered the rest of the questions flawlessly, but that answer stuck with me. Such a strange reaction. Not only did he answer wrong to an obvious question, but it was also such an odd explanation. Logan himself seemed to have trouble finding the right word for it. The second test was similar, but there were new cards. In sets of 3, Logan was supposed to explain each emotion presented by the people in the pictures. Happy, sad, angry, scared. It was similar to the first test, but much more detailed. For every image, there would be a description and a short explanation given by the participant. We pressed forward. First 3 cards, no problem. Happy, happy, sad. Easy explanations. Second set of cards, same result. Surprised, sad, sad. But when the third image set came along, I didn't know what to say. 3 people, all completely neutral. Not a single emotion on their face. They looked almost computer-generated. Logan didn't skip a beat, though.
"She's scared,"
he said.
"She doesn't know why she's doing this."
"And what about this one?"
"Oh, he's hungry. He just doesn't show it."
Hungry? Is that the emotion?
"Yeah, he's really hungry. Dangerous."
And the third one? Logan took a long, hard look. After a few seconds, he looked up at me, almost like he forgot about the picture for a while.
"Okay, I think he's Obstin."
Obstin?
"Yeah, Obstin.
What do you mean?
That's what he is. I don't know a better word for it."
So why is he, obstin?
"He saw something he shouldn't have."
We continued with several more image sets, and Logan gave mostly ordinary answers. But every now and then he'd throw in something absurd sounding. Obstin was the first, but there was also ADR, Gald, and Shriet. The descriptions were outlandish and, frankly, nonsensical. A doctor. He stared too long into the light. Gald. He didn't go swimming, but his feet are still wet. Shrit. He fell between the cracks. By the time I was about to start the third experiment, I had a few moments alone with Logan's mom. Still anxious, she held her arms close to herself and didn't meet my eyes. "We'll be done in a bit," I said. "He's doing great."
He's such an imaginative child, you know.
She nodded.
He makes up things all the time. You should see his drawings.
"Does he have any trouble at school?"
No, not really, no.
She smiled.
Well, mostly not. Some of the other kids can get a bit creeped out when he starts making things up.
I checked the clock. It was time to start the final experiment. All kids have a quirk or two, I smiled back. That's what makes them kids. The final experiment was about recognizing places rather than people. One by one, I was to show Logan pictures of various places. Ordinary places like supermarkets, playgrounds, and factories. They were pretty easy to recognize. First, I'd show him the pictures. Then, I'd ask him to describe the scene. Logan didn't seem to mind. The pictures themselves was easy for Logan to recognize. One by one, he explained what he saw. Factories with lots of cars parked outside, empty playgrounds. But as we got to a park, he sort of stopped. His expression shifted.
"That's a graveyard,"
he said. I had to stop myself from correcting him. It was obviously not a graveyard. "Can you describe it?" I asked.
I really don't want to. There's a lot of people there."
"What kind of people?" I was going off script, but I was just too curious. Logan leaned in to look closer at the picture.
"There's a lot of strange colors,"
he said.
"The people who used to be there are gone."
I couldn't tell what he was seeing. The picture was empty. As we finished up, Logan went to the bathroom. I got some time to talk to his mom on our own, and I brought out the picture of the park. "Do you have any idea what he sees here?" I asked.
No.
She said, shaking her head.
Could be anything.
"It's just strange," I said. "Usually kids make up stories about dragons, lasers, wizards, and that kind of stuff. Not graveyards and parks."
Are you calling my son strange?
I lost my train of thought. As Logan came back, she grabbed him by the arm as to leave. Before they did, I caught up to them. I had to try something. "Logan," I said, "just a moment." They stopped, and his mom gave me a tired look. "I was thinking about buying this house," I said, bringing up a photo of a place I'd been checking out a few times. "What do you think?" He just stared at me as if he didn't understand. He took off his baseball cap and scratched his ear.
"Looks dirty,"
he said.
"A lot of art, Joe. Right there in the..."
Come on, Logan.
His mother tugged his arm, and he was almost dragged down the hall. Turning back to me one last time, he yelled back.
"He looked up, and then he didn't!"
I didn't lie when I said I was thinking about buying that house. There was an open viewing the next day, and I decided to drop by on my lunch break. There were about 8 other people there, all couples. I kind of disappeared among them. Maybe I wasn't being considered as a serious buyer. The place was a bit too large for me after all. As the realtor ran off to speak to a pregnant couple, I stopped in the foyer. I had this strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Ro," I whispered to myself. "Right here." Just saying it out loud almost made me feel it. It was something so specific, so unique. It wasn't an emotion as much as it was an experience, a story. I could imagine myself lying on the floor, looking up at the wood-brown ceiling. I could feel my back growing stiff as if I'd been lying down for too long. I could feel my eyes growing thick, like blinking through mud. Every breath, a conscious effort. Arms unresponsive. A prayer for my heart to keep beating. Then, nothing. Ro, to look up, and then to not. I had this strange understanding, like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. Didn't the kid have a word for that too? God, I felt sick. Everyone was gathered around the realtor in the living room. I don't know what gave me the courage to confront him, but I just blurted it out. "Did the previous owner die here?" I asked. "In the foyer?"
No, they didn't."
he answered.
You have to tell us if they did.
One of the couples said. Another couple agreed.
Okay, yeah, I mean, no one has died here. That much is true. No one did. But yes, they were found unresponsive in the foyer.
There were loud sighs. A couple immediately left. Another left shortly afterwards. There was a queue to talk to the realtor, and within 10 minutes, I was the only one left. Row or not, I got the place too cheap to care. This made me curious as to the words the kid had used to describe the various places and emotions. Over the following days, as I transcribed our findings, I started thinking about them a lot more. Staring into the light too long? To get wet feet without swimming, it was all just cryptic nonsense. But what I'd felt that first night in my new house, that was a row. I could feel it. It was the right way to describe it. One night, as I stood in the bathroom, I thought about the word aider. It was what Logan had used to describe staring into the light for too long. It felt fitting, but I didn't know if I'd experienced it. I tried looking up into the bathroom light and just saying it out loud, but I didn't get the same feeling as when I'd said "ho" in the foyer. This wasn't it. This wasn't a deer. I sort of gave up on it after a while. But as I was watching TV, the thought came creeping back to me. There was a news segment about a patient with severe brain damage, a woman who couldn't breathe on her own or speak. She was aware in a sense, but completely imprisoned in her body. The segment focused on how her family was caring for her, but I just leaned in closer and looked at her. Aider, I whispered to myself. That's it. And it was. No question about it. She was Audra from staring into the light too long. I could feel it, understand it. Over the next couple of days, I started chasing Gald. The word meant someone whose feet was wet, despite not swimming. It took me a while to get this one, but I finally found it in a newspaper article online. I felt galled from reading about a man who had died from an overdose down at the beach. His body had apparently choked itself, causing him to sweat to death. As he was homeless and living close to the beach, he'd been found by a couple of teenagers building a sandcastle. But that feeling of drowning on dry land next to the ocean, that was gold. With the right word, I could feel it. I could empathize. In my mind, I could be there with him. But the final word I'd noted, Srit. That was a difficult one. Over several days, I looked all over the internet. I searched forums, read obscure articles ranging back to the 90s, but I just couldn't shoot blindly into the web and hope for the best. I had to find out more, get something substantial. That thought made me take a step back. What about the photos? The photos we had shown Logan in the first place? Who were the people in the photos? I checked the inventory list for the experiment. Most of the cards were just mentioned as a number and emotion, but I noticed that some of the faces were repeated with the same actors. All the cards which Logan had gotten right were repeated at least once, but the weird ones. Those were unique faces. The lighting was different. They didn't show any peculiar emotions. They were just strange people. A bit off. I took a few photos with my phone and tried to do an image search. I couldn't get a single hit. These pictures simply weren't available anywhere online. The ordinary emotions displayed could be found on various stock image sites, but not the strange ones that Logan pointed out. Finally, after a few hours and dozens of pages clicked through, I did find a picture that looked like one of the models, but in a completely different setting, and this was freaking weird. The picture I found online was from a social media profile. The profile, in turn, portrayed the user page of the very same homeless man that had drowned in his own sweat from an overdose. The same one I'd read an article of. But the article was written just a few days prior, and the picture must have been taken at least weeks ago. Listen, I don't know if you can get this. What Logan did was to perfectly describe, using one of his made-up words, was exactly what was about to happen to that man. The man who galled, who overdosed on the beach. I mulled the whole thing over in my head countless times, and finally, I just gave up. I had to talk to Logan again. I did the creepiest thing I've ever done. I tracked the kid down at his school, following day, as he was about to get on the bus back home, I waved at him from across the parking lot. He was surprised to see me and couldn't place me at first. Then I could see him recognize me, like something lit up in his mind.
Hey!
He called out.
Science man!
Hey, Logan, I called back. How's it been?
Good.
He said.
You're not here for more tests, are you?
He stopped a few feet ahead of me. Actually, I'm just here to ask you about that language of yours. Those strange words you use. How do you come up with them?
That's easy,
he said.
Once you start talking it, you kinda don't stop. After a while, you just feel them, you know?
So, where did you learn it? I asked. Anywhere special?
I think I always knew, he shrugged. Like, it's weird, like listening, but not to a sound, but like a color. It's just sorta there, inside.
So you can always see it? Because sometimes you said people in pictures were just happy or sad. Ordinary things?
Well, sometimes those things are easier to see. You said I should answer fast, not, accurately.
So you can see it now? I chuckled. Anywhere? Here, with me?
Sure.
He smiled.
Just stand still for a bit.
Logan looked at me for a while. As I met his eyes, I could feel something. There was that feeling again. Obstinate. To see something I shouldn't have. Right there, in that kid's eyes. He knew something. Strangely enough, it wasn't him that broke the silence. It was me. Atho S, I said. I didn't know why I said it, but it took Logan by surprise.
The one who shouts until they listen.
He said.
That's what it means, right? I think that's me.
I said, and I'm sorry, Logan, I don't know why I said that.
Did you see it?
He asked, almost excited.
Do you see it now?
I want to say that I didn't. I want to say I saw nothing, but that'd be a lie. A million little words crept into my mind, and as I stared into that kid's eyes, I saw something I shouldn't have. Now it was all becoming clearer. The more words I knew, the better I understood. The word I'd looked for, Zrit, was a lot more complex than Logan had made it out to be with human words. It was contextual. The man had died in an earthquake. He fell between the cracks. No, he hadn't. He was going to. It was describing events destined to unfold. But it was also describing something that had happened. Was it both? Neither? I see it, I admitted. Right there, I could feel the parking lot falling away in insignificance. With a single unspoken word, we could tell each other infinite things. These mundane expressions were just the tip of the iceberg, a dumbed-down shadow of what was truly being said. The words told us of things that were, things that could be, and things that currently was. And in that moment of silence, of understanding, I heard the vibrant colors so clearly I could almost see them. They were piercing into my mind, forcing themselves into my understanding, screaming to me that once you understand something, you can't unlearn it. I forgot to breathe, as to not accidentally say something I shouldn't. You weren't talking about the picture I held up in the test. You were looking at me, I said with nothing but a shallow breath. Obsten. I'm Obsten. You didn't even look at the picture. He didn't have to answer. I knew it was true. It was written into the word itself that my realization would come. Then, as possibilities came rushing towards me, I could feel an enormous weight come down on me. My mind couldn't take it. My body was shutting down as I fell to my knees, screaming until my neck felt raw. The world started to fade as my heartbeat swallowed my hearing. I have a hard time describing what happened next. When I closed my eyes, I'd see millions of possibilities. Mostly pain, suffering, and terror. My own thoughts and emotions multiplied like a torch in a hall of mirrors. I'd see myself waking up in my bed, only to get murdered by 1,000 different weapons. I'd see myself drowning in my bathtub, breaking my neck, falling down the stairs. Death. So much death. And then in the blink of an eye, I'd be in the back of an ambulance, feeling the residual effect of a defibrillator on my chest. As I blinked, the ambulance burst into flames. The driver crashed into a tree, someone carving their initials into my chest with a scalpel. None of it was real, but I couldn't tell anymore. Different worlds, with nothing but a well-placed syllable. All the while, I was just spitting out seemingly random words. My eyes lost focus, and as I lost grip of reality, my body shut itself down in self-defense. Thank God. This was back in January of 2019. Logan was born with this language already stored in the back of his mind, some kind of residual effect from his contamination. But for people like you and me, we can't take it all at once, so over the years, with intense therapy to back me up, I've settled on trying to learn one single word. I'm going to find out as much as I can about just what it means to be obstinate, the word describing me. There was so much to that one word that you could fill a lifetime with it. In a way, maybe that was the point. A God language, meant to fit all of our very beings into simple expressions, like compressing a folder into a zip file. But that's just the thing. To learn what it really means to be obstinate, to be my word, I can't really do anything else but to live and see what happens. Not unless I want to go back to where my mind wandered off to. Still, sometimes I can feel something creeping back into my mind. Little tingles, syllables and sounds, reminding me of all the knowledge I still have stored away somewhere in my inner madness. Little words with galactic proportions. It is so easy to slip back into that mind, just inches away from the edge of what my physical brain can hold. I sometimes wonder what all your words are. I sometimes wonder what they mean. I'll really try not to think about it.
Hello and welcome to Daytime, your place for scary stories, straight from the horror forums of Reddit. Make sure to like and subscribe for more horror tales of things that go bumping the night. On tonight's episode, a man must seek answers from the most unlikely of sources. So, tuck yourself in, or grab a coat for your stroll, and stay far away from the Wheelbarrow Cult.
My mother left us when I was 6 years old. She'd been having an affair with a coworker and it turned into a relationship. My dad got full custody of it, and this huge part of our lives just disappeared seemingly overnight. A year later, my mother had moved to Sarasota and was about to have her second kid, what would be my half-brother Charles. My father never really recovered. He tried to get back out there, but some levels of trust just can't be regained. Still, time passes. Two halves of a family repaired themselves. And even though my relationship with my mother never quite recovered, we kept in touch. A periphery touch, but still, if something were to happen, I got to hear about it. And then there was Charles, my half-brother. I didn't know him. Everything about his very existence had always been painted in sort of a black cloud. I hated him not for who he was, but for what he was. An expression of the most turbulent time in my youth. I hated him. I couldn't help it, and I knew nothing of him. But I hated him nonetheless. I didn't pay much attention to Charles and his antics. He was just this person somewhere off in the distance, living his own life. I saw the occasional high school photo, or him recommending something off his Spotify playlist. He was just some guy. I wasn't there to celebrate any of the big birthdays, and he didn't celebrate any of mine. Charles turned 21 in 2017. I saw some pictures of a big party, and there was an open-ended invitation for anyone to come join. I'm sure I'd have been allowed to if I wanted. But that was never really on the agenda. It wasn't even discussed. I had my own life at that point, and patching that bridge seemed useless. Like trying to fix something that you worked your whole life to get around. What's the point in fixing a bridge when you're an Olympic swimmer? Something like that. There were things happening behind the scenes that I didn't know of until much later. For example, Charles had been having anxiety issues since middle school. He was riddled with phobias and panic attacks. He'd been having trouble keeping up in school, and most of his friends were, at best, superficial. The kind of people who turn their back on you when the going gets tough. I had no idea about any of that, but I was about to get a lot more involved in his life than I'd ever asked for. It was late July in 2018. I was coming home from a long shift and had stopped to get some groceries when my phone went off. I loaded in the last paper bag, gave my girlfriend an apologetic look, and took the call. It was my mother. I hadn't spoken directly to her for decades.
Hey, Blue Jay.
She sighed in that.
I'm sorry it's been so long.
My first reaction was anger. How dare she call me that still? It turned my stomach sour. like I'd swallowed something smoldering. I managed to keep things polite, biting my lip. Everything all right? She had to be calling for a reason. She wanted something. She'd never talk to me without a reason.
It's about your brother,
she said.
I don't know what to do.
I don't have a brother.
But you do.
She sighed.
You do, and I think he needs you.
She explained the situation as best she could. As a way to deal with his issues, Charles had been seeking advice and guidance from people outside of his usual social circles. Harmless stuff at first. Spiritual guides and faith healers. He'd studied Buddhism and Hinduism to broaden his horizons. And he'd been trying everything from yoga to revival gatherings. But lately, things had taken a turn.
It's just been one thing after another.
My mom explained.
And now it's just, he's gone all quiet.
Isn't that a good thing?
Charles tells me everything.
She sighed.
This isn't like him. I can't get a hold of him.
So, just call the police.
He's an adult now.
There was a short break. She composed herself, clearly upset. My callous tone wasn't helping.
I think he's with some bad people.
She reached out to me, figuring I'd be someone far enough in the periphery to go under the radar. Someone they wouldn't question too much. Everyone else in Charles's life seemed to be blacklisted and turned away at the door, but perhaps an unknown half-brother might slip by. That's what she argued anyway.
I know I can't ask you to help,
she said,
but I think it could do us some good, all of us. Family is important to you, huh?
Again, silence. I just shook my head. I'd opened the car door and sat down. My girlfriend could tell I was upset and was leaning over to hug me. I hadn't even noticed how hard I was digging my fingers into the dashboard until I saw them turning pale.
You don't have to believe me,
Mom said.
But it really is.
And with that, I hung up. I argued with myself back and forth for days. Charles had never done anything to hurt me, but I couldn't help but to hate him. But it was difficult to say whether that hate was more important than that sinking feeling I had in my stomach. Even then, even at my lowest, angriest point, I couldn't bring myself to want to hurt my mother. I couldn't. So I decided to help, all other things be damned. At the very least, I could show her I'd turned into a good man, all without her help. I texted her to get me all the info she could, and I booked a flight over the following week. I made my way to Florida. I'd been getting tons of emails with all kinds of images, descriptions, and video, but I hadn't taken the time to sit down and review it all. I had a rough idea. According to my mom, it had started with a nightmare. She told me that Charles kept having nightmares about a boy in blue. He'd call her late at night, rambling about it in a half-woken stupor. These nightmares would control his life, and he would try to find subtle ways of dealing with it. To an outsider, it just seemed like much of his other anxieties, a fixed idea that he couldn't rid himself of. There were pictures of his apartment. He'd remove the curtains from the windows to make sure the boy in blue could spot him if need be. Later, he would just opt to sleep out in the open. Something about the clear blue sky being a relaxing factor, and there were other little things. He started to wear more formal shirts. He cut his hair. He started growing strange flowers in his front yard. And then, radio silence. Gone. First thing I did was to check his apartment. Just like my mom had said, there were no curtains. I could see straight in, and it was easy to tell it hadn't been used for quite some time. I got the impression that something had happened there. It was just too barren. A 20-something-year-old with an interest in religion and philosophy and not a single piece of memorabilia. No books, nothing. The place was a ghost town. Hell, at least the sunflowers he'd planted were doing well. Not a fan of the blue color, though. Those things didn't look natural. The final straw was seeing the pile of mail by the front door. It was substantial. We were talking a couple of months at least. Reminders on reminders. Then there was the core of the issue, the group he'd been involved in. The Church of the 12th Sky Assembly. They had a bit of a social media presence, but they didn't have much to say. They seemed like your average run-of-the-mill group, with smiling young people offering companionship and understanding in their outreach material. It was so general that I felt like I'd seen it before. I had a bit of luck, though. Turns out, they had a community event going on later that day. I figured it was a good way to get my foot in the door. Probably wasn't the best idea to just go knocking on their compound. From what I could find, they had a place out by Lake Parish, but it seemed to be a members-only kind of deal. Not much said about it on their socials. So I drove out to Bradenton Beach, hoping to spot these nut jobs in action. Turns out it wasn't as difficult as I'd imagined. They'd made themselves a bit of a stand down by the beach where they were handing out flyers. Looking at it from a distance, you might mistake it for an energy drink program. About a dozen beach-fit young people eagerly engaging in conversation. It seemed so disingenuous. Still, I gave it a shot. I put my sandals on and took a casual stroll, pretending to be passing by. It didn't take long for a young man and woman to come up to me, their smiles as white as the flyers they were handing out. "Excuse me," they smiled.
"Having a nice day?"
"Can't complain," I smiled right back. "You folks out here selling something?"
"Nah."
They chuckled.
"Just sharing the good vibes."
And with that, I had a pamphlet in my hand. I stuck around to talk to them for a bit. As a whole, the organization didn't look that strange. But once you started singling out individual pieces, you could see some inconsistencies. For example, their logo. For a church called the 12th Sky Assembly, one might imagine clouds or a cross. But no, their logo was a wheelbarrow, one of those old-timey wooden ones. I counted the pegs on the wheel, but it just added up to 7. It wasn't even numerically consistent. Then there were the members themselves. I got the impression that this wasn't an actual passion of theirs. They seemed disconnected, and their lines seemed practiced. Like they weren't really members of the church, but just paid to be there. The way they talked, when they didn't think anyone was listening, sort of confirmed this. This was all an act. But for what? "Are you the folks out by up by Lake Parish?" I asked. "I think I've seen that logo before."
"That's just administrative. We're in 7 different cities across the state, so it takes a whole lot of effort from a whole lot of people to keep things running."
They immediately got defensive. I tried to shift away from the compound, instead talking about meetings and other members, but they'd already soured. It wasn't until one of the folks in the background approached that I felt like I was getting somewhere. He was a man in his early 50s, with short blonde hair and a sizable gut. Large black glasses, a white shirt, and a blue tie. He patted the others on the shoulder and smiled at me.
"You consider yourself a man of many questions, friend?"
he asked. "I suppose I am. Not a lot of places to ask them nowadays."
"Well, I hope you find what you're looking for."
And with that, he turned his back on me. I must have said something to spook them. I had no choice but to go all in. "The boy in blue," I said. It was the first thing that came to mind. It had been the central theme in Charles's issues. It had to mean something. The man turned around, adjusted his glasses, and squinted at me.
"The boy in blue, huh?"
"Yeah," I nodded. "It's been keeping me up at night."
"I can imagine."
He put his hand on my shoulder and took a deep breath. Finally, his eyes met mine. This time, his smile was genuine.
"Perhaps we got a few things to talk about after all."
I spent the better part of the day talking to that man. His name was Isaiah, and he was one of the aspiring members of the church. He'd been with them for a couple of months and was still getting his bearings. Still, what I'd said resonated with me. The boy in blue was a common theme among the church's inner circle. They said it was a prophetic vision, a guideline for things to come. Later in the afternoon, as we were calling it a day, Isaiah and I circled back to the tent they'd set up down at the beach. I almost stumbled over one of the wheelbarrows they had there, and I couldn't help but to ask about it.
"It's an unusual symbol, I'll freely admit to that."
Isaiah chuckled.
"But it's about picking yourself up, about extending yourself beyond your usual capabilities."
"That's a lot to ask from a wheelbarrow."
"We don't ask anything from the wheelbarrow."
He smiled.
"It's about you. You're the one who has to pick it up. But it's there when you need it."
Having a foot in the door, I settled into a temporary routine. I called my girlfriend every night, keeping her updated on what was going on. I sent a text to my mom every now and then too, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to her. I would spend my afternoon messaging Isaiah and trying to keep a low profile, waiting for an invitation to something further. If I could just get a chance to meet the other members, there'd be a chance of me meeting up with Charles. And maybe I wouldn't be able to get him out of there, but at least I could make sure he was okay. I met Isaiah a couple of times over the following week. Once for lunch, and another time at a separate event. I was invited to help, and I accepted. I mostly printed pamphlets and helped setting up their tent. The pamphlet wasn't that interesting. The logo, an address for an office downtown, and an inspirational quote about reaching for the sky. Not much more than that. I got the impression that handing them out was mostly a way to get an excuse to talk to people, rather than to share a message. Almost as if it was expected for them to do this. The more I spent time with Isaiah, I got the impression that this wasn't just a church. There were no priests or preachers, and there were no spectacular meetings. If anything, they were just going through the motions. Everything pointed to the compound by Lake Parish. There had to be something there, and Isaiah was my way in. I had to try something big. The third time I met him, I hadn't showered for 3 days. I pretended to have slept in my car, and I made up a lie about going through a rough breakup. Isaiah was a bit surprised, but bounced back as the gears in the back of his mind clicked into place.
Sorry to hear that,
he said.
You made a beautiful couple.
It was an innocent enough sentiment, but there was an uncomfortable reveal hidden in it. He knew what my girlfriend looked like. I'd never shown him a picture. Had they been looking me up?
I guess that's why you're out here, huh? Starting over.
I'm just in a bad place, I said. I barely get enough sleep as is.
No, I hear you.
He nodded.
I've been there, but it's like sometimes the cure is worse than the disease, you know?
Him saying that stood out to me. This wasn't a man trying to trick me into a cult. This was a man trying to keep me out. It was a warning, not an invitation. Anything is better than this, I sighed. Isaiah looked me in the eye, clearly concerned. He tapped a nearby wheelbarrow.
All right then.
We drove out to Lake Parish later that day. It was a silent trip with Isaiah behind the wheel. No radio, no small talk. If anything, he seemed apologetic. He didn't want me to do this. Following a side road, we passed a sign that reminded us that we were entering private property. Not long after, we reached a chain-linked fence. Isaiah had a key for the padlock. The compound was not what I expected. A trio of one-story buildings out in a field, covered from end to end by the fences and trees. The knee-length grass that covered the area made the place look abandoned. A handful of people in white shirts moved between the buildings, pointing at one another and having lively discussions. So what can I expect? Do all people here have the same problem?
Yeah.
Isaiah nodded.
But not all are willing to deal with it.
He looked up at me, but not in the eye. He wasn't sure about this.
Talk to Miss Miller,
he continued,
and go from there.
I got some time to just walk around the compound, looking for Charles. There was a central area between the three buildings that looked like a sort of gathering spot. The ground was flattened and the grass cut, with 6 wheelbarrows off to the side. I don't know why, but I felt this unease looking at them. They all had these dark splotches at the end. There were probably about a dozen people there at the time. Isaiah took the car and left, leaving me to speak with this Miller woman on my own. She had an office on the west end of the front building, almost like a reception. I couldn't get over how sparsely decorated the place was. A logo every now and then, the occasional wheelbarrow, and that was it. The place was pretty much sterile. It even smelled like a hospital. Miss Miller was an older woman with short gray hair and thick glasses. She asked me to come in and sit down across from her and fill out a form. I was asked to surrender my phone, keys, and wallet. The form asked for all kinds of personal info, including password and username for various social media accounts. But what surprised me the most was the second page, which was all about my proposed anxiety issues. There were 3 spaces for paragraphs where I was supposed to describe my meetings with the boy in blue. I just made something up, trying to keep the small talk up. Miller didn't have much to say. She assured me that there was help to get, but that they needed complete honesty from me. I tried to ask her a bit about the other members, which she called patients, and how they were dealing with it, to which she had this to say.
What you're experiencing is no fault of your own,
she said.
It is not by the will of a god, or Satan, or anything in between. It is beyond our measure, and so, The steps to stop it may seem drastic.
I had to go through a quick physical checkup. I had to fill out a health form, and they tested my blood. There was a surprising amount of people on hand who seemed to have a medical background. Some seemed to have a corporate background. I noticed a lot of boxes with a particular pharmaceutical company. It looked like a sort of axe or hatchet. When all things looked to be in order, I was guided to a personal room at the far end of the compound. A long corridor with locked doors, from which I could hear groaning and crying. A nurse rushed past me with an armful of bloody linens. Miss Miller showed me to a private room. Not much to it, a bathroom, a bed, an end table, no windows, and the door locked from outside. The latter I didn't notice until the door clicked close. I probably spent the better part of a day locked in that room. I could hear people in the other rooms. Most of them weren't saying anything coherent. Some were crying, others just screamed. Someone tried to keep their composure and politely asked for help, all coming from muffled voices from behind locked doors. Now, I don't have a way to check, but I think it took about 12 hours or so in total. I'd arrived early in the morning. By the time the door opened, it was getting dark outside. My first thought was to get the hell out of there, but I was in too deep. I'd invested too much, and I just had to finish it. If Charles was stuck in this place, it was time to get him out. When one of the nurses let me out, I was handed a wicker basket with various hygiene articles and some fresh clothes. Washed and cleaned, I was put in a line with other people. Some who looked worse for wear, others who didn't seem to know what was going on. There was this one woman who could barely stand up and had to lean on one of the nurse attendants. Looking at them, it was easy to forget that this was supposed to be a religious organization. It looked more like a hospital. We were taken out into the middle of the compound. There were about a dozen attendants and 9 other people like me who'd been taken out there. They turned on a series of floodlights, bathing the yard in pale white. That's when I saw Charles. He must have lost at least 30 pounds. The guy was skin and bones. His hair had fallen out and he had this patchy, unshaved mess on his face. He looked completely out of it. I couldn't imagine him recognizing me even in a healthy state. But now that I'd seen him, I was glad I was there. I was going to help him one way or another. I just had to get through whatever this was supposed to be. We all lined up in a circle, each with a wheelbarrow in front of us. Everyone else lifted them up by the handles, and one by one, they were administered a pill. People just took them, no questions asked. I could hear a single protest, someone not being sure. They were simply asked if they wanted help or not. They did, and down the pill went. When it was my turn, I just shook my head. No, thank you.
Then we're gonna have to ask you to leave,
said the nurse. I looked around the circle. I was holding up the line. There was no ifs, ands, or buts here. If you wanted their help, you took the pill. So I did. It was a sort of muscle relaxant. It wasn't a powerful hallucinogen or anything like that. Just something that made my shoulders slump and my speech slur. But looking around the circle, it seemed to have a massive effect on the others. The nurses went patient by patient and recorded what they were saying, making notes on a spreadsheet when there was something of particular interest. Most folks were just rambling incoherently, but a few of them were strangely lucid. Some were naming places or things, vague descriptions of events unfolding. A few of the nurses were asking targeted questions, or even making demands.
Ask him to show you the Portuguese election,
one nurse said.
Are you getting anything?
I was asked to share my experiences too. I just copied a bit from what I heard others say. I could tell they weren't entirely convinced. They went out of their way to get a light to shine in my face, but before they got a chance to, one of the guys next to me started freaking out. He was in his early 40s. Didn't look all that peculiar. Pretty fit, somewhat shorter than usual, balding. Reading glasses with a crooked frame. His knuckles had gone white, and he started shaking his wheelbarrow. His eyes rolled back in his skull.
A fire!
He screamed at me.
I see a fire!
The nurses flocked to him.
He's showing me a fire. Screams. A highway cut off it by fallen trees. Late autumn. November? Crackling bark. Turning black.
Look for a license plate,
one of the nurses said.
Can you see a license plate?
Oh, Ontario?
One of them ran off, speaking loudly to a phone. Others stepped back. They all looked at the man with anticipation.
He releases me,
the man said.
I'm released.
And with that, there was a sudden quiet. The nurses looked away as if bracing themselves. I didn't look away, but I wish I had. His voice became more distant as his jaw extended. His tongue was swelling. So was his abdomen. Seconds later, there was a loud pop. Blood and viscera exploded out of his stomach, filling the wheelbarrow. Then, another pop, as his tongue did the same. Then, he just stood there, bleeding out, frozen, holding that wheelbarrow. A tool to keep him from staining the ground. No one reacted. No one recoiled or ran or screamed. It was just this eerie quiet. I could feel panic boiling in my chest, but I tried not to stick out. There was no telling what they'd do if they thought I was faking it. About half a minute later, it happened to another one. The nurses called out to one another, confirming what they had heard. Fire, Ontario, late November. They were cross-examining information and details given by these people. Every bone in my body was telling me to run, to just beeline to Charles, get him and head for the exit. But looking at the dead man to my left, still standing, holding his wheelbarrow, there was a primal part of me that refused to move. I felt like an antelope watching a lion pass me by. A twitch of the leg might set it off. I had to wait. They were poking and prodding at the others, asking them questions. 4 people in total seemed to have something to share. And the same 4 people popped like overly ripe berries. Their faces had this look of relief on them. Like this was a kind of reward. This was what they aspired to get. The thought struck me that perhaps this was what awaited Charles as well. I looked at him as his head started to swivel back and forth. His eyes were rolling back. I couldn't wait. I took my first steps towards him. No one noticed at first, but as I gained speed, others called out. They asked me to stop, to wait, to listen. But as I saw Charles's hands tighten around the grip of the wheelbarrow and his voice rising in cadence, I didn't consider the consequences. I had to try something. Anything. So I tackled him. And the moment I put my hands on him, something inside me broke. I looked into his face as the world shifted. I was standing on a highway among dozens of broken down cars, burning trees falling all around us to the screams of hundreds. Charles was there. We were running in the wrong direction, watching people choke to death inside their cars. Others just walked into the woods, falling over from asphyxiation. Further down the road, a child, a boy, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in blue. That's who we were heading for. Charles looked back at me.
He's showing us,
he said.
We have to keep.
I grabbed him. I slammed him to the ground. I could feel the texture of the asphalt on my hands. I could taste the burning oak trees. But it wasn't real, and it couldn't be. In the blink of an eye, we were on a plane, falling through the sky. Oxygen masks long since deployed. People screaming as alarms blared. Again, just down the aisle, a little boy in blue, waiting for us to come closer, wanting to show us more.
He's trying to save us,
Charles cried.
He needs me to...
No! Another blink of the eye. Standing on a beach, watching a cruise ship slowly capsize, I forced myself to look away, to not see the name of it. I grabbed Charles by the face, forcing his eyes to lock onto mine. Blink after blink after blink. Earthquakes, shootings, fires, lightning strikes, hurricanes, floods, bursting dams, falling bridges, knives and guns, hangings to cheering crowds. Death. 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 Then, for a brief moment, grass. Back in that field, in that compound. People were coming for us. Charles was next to me, clutching his stomach. I leaned over, grabbed him under the arms, and lifted him to his feet. If I was going to have to drag him out, I would. Blink. A congregation standing in a massive cathedral with the ceiling music. Idols and Latin hymns crumbling, dark shades in the distance growing closer, then back again, screaming all around me. Another patient has burst on the other side of the field, filling another wheelbarrow. Blink, blink, blink. Soon, the screaming was getting harder to tell apart. Some of it coming from the nurses, others coming from the patients, others still coming from God knows where. It was all getting mixed up. Still, I carried Charles step by step out towards the front fences, trying my best not to have him look at anything for too long. His stomach was moving, literally, physically moving. His eyes were rolling back and forth. His tongue swelled to the point where words turned to noises. I had to get him away from this, to distract him. Something. I closed my eyes, a wave of hot air stinking of sulfur. An endless highway. Waves of red sand blasting us from all sides, blistering our skin. Rattling bones litter the side of the road, bearing witness to countless people who've fallen. Off in the distance, a boy in blue, urging me to look closer, to get sucked in, just like the rest of them. I cover my eyes, as well as Charles.
You need to know.
A voice whispers right next to my ear.
You need to see.
Something is pressed into my hand. I protest, I scream. I feel the sand burrowing into my skin. Suddenly, I am sitting down. A soft wind, the click of a seatbelt, then sudden acceleration. I thought it another vision, but it lasted too long.
Hold on.
A gate crashing open. I was in the backseat of a car with Charles next to me. He was doubled over, crying hysterically. In the front seat was Isaiah, stepping on the gas.
I'm sorry.
He gasped as he turned the car around, heading for the highway.
This is the only way to stop it. It's the only way it ends.
And with that, we sped into the night. By morning, Charles was getting better. His stomach wasn't moving anymore, and his tongue wasn't swelling. His eyes were red, but he could focus again. He was barely speaking, but visibly conscious. He responded to questions, albeit non-verbally. Isaiah confided in me that he'd been plagued by the same visions as Charles for some time, but couldn't bring himself to go all the way. He'd seen the end goal, how the nurses poked and prodded for people to extend themselves.
That's not the way I want to go.
He sighed.
No matter what, that's not it.
He shared a cigarette with me. I hadn't smoked since high school.
I saw what you were trying to do,
he admitted.
You were making the same choice that I'd had. Except you were showing it, you know? You were doing something. I've just been coasting along.
Isaiah told me all he knew. That the church was sponsored by some kind of pharmaceutical company. That their religious front was basically a way to identify legitimate targets and bring them in. To turn them into this sort of commodity. A wheelbarrow man. Someone who could share something about things to come for a company to exploit.
They're not telling you the whole story,
Isaiah continued.
They don't tell you that it passes, that it comes and goes in waves, leaping from one person to another, and that if you just refuse to listen hard enough, it will leave you alone.
So they offer a fast and easy way at the cost of your life.
Yeah.
Isaiah nodded.
Story as old as time.
He looked down at his cigarette with a sigh, flicking it away. Charles was slowly recovering. He could barely speak, and we had to help him in and out of the car, but he made it back home. I thought I'd be angry seeing my mom again, but there was no way to get angry at a smile that honest. Her sense of relief was infectious, and that time when she hugged me and called me her blue jay, I couldn't help but to feel like she meant it. That one time, at the very least. And that was that. I've kept in touch with them over the years. Charles was in and out of therapy, slowly recovering from his painful visions. He got back on his feet about the time when the COVID pandemic hit. Isaiah got completely out of the Church of the 12th Sky Assembly, instead getting involved in local politics in his home state of Indiana. I think he works some kind of local campaign there. I'd like to say I've grown closer with my mother's side of the family, but that's not really how the world works. This was an anomaly in many senses of the word. I'm sure they are thankful, but apart from the occasional greeting or birthday card, things are as they always have been. So, in a way, things are as they always have been. And in another very real sense, nothing is. See, something was pressed into my hand that night. I haven't told anyone about it, and I probably never will. A note with names, dates, and events. I don't want to think about it too much, or I might fall victim to the same thing that Charles did. Even talking about it now brings this sinking feeling into the pit of my stomach. Still, I can't deny that I can recognize some of these names in the news, and it's making my nervous. But it raises an important question. Would the knowledge we could gain from this be worth a life? Could it save others? Is it even real? The fire reference that night never happened, as far as I know. But if they hadn't spoken about it, could it have happened? I think the only way to get a clear answer is to look a bit closer and put it all on the line.